Well, Anna, this week I wanted to do something that I promised myself I would never do, which is take down a viral hashtag resistance Twitter thread. And I know what you're thinking, people at home, owning the libs. Come on, that's so easy. It's a cheap shot. But this one comes from a very specific liberal, and it's one who I find myself generally respecting more than 99% of other liberals, MSNBC's very own Chris Hayes. And Chris Hayes is a really good guy, and he seems like a really good guy, and he's actually pretty smart. He started his career on what could be called the far left of the American political spectrum of the early aughts. He was writing really sharp pieces for magazines like In These Times and The Nation, which are pretty on the extreme left, especially like in that era where there was no Jacobin, for example. But as the 2010s rolled around, Chris started getting work hosting on MSNBC. And since then, his politics have become much more mainstream liberal. And this week, he had a viral Twitter thread in which he gleefully punched to his left. And I think it's worth taking a look at. It started, quote, "For the first 3 or so years of Trump's term, there was a certain mode of analysis fairly common among self-styled savvy centrists, hashtag resistance-averse leftists, and tons of conservatives that basically held that everyone freaking out about Trump was being overwrought and hysterical." Chris expounded on the point. The argument went, look, yes, he's a jerk and says crazy stuff, but the country is basically not that changed. Unemployment is low. Daily life continues as normal. There aren't tanks in the streets. You libs have lost your minds, obsessing over Russia and each new scandal, etc. This, my friends, is the world's biggest straw man. Chris is trying to play into the liberal horseshoe theory that the right and the left are basically the same and that only they, the liberals, are right. But to say that the left believes that everything was fine under Trump because unemployment was low and that daily life continues as normal is disingenuous at best. The left argument has always been that even under the good liberal Obama, the status quo in America was a daily moral catastrophe, given that millions lived in poverty, millions were uninsured, hundreds of thousands lived on the streets, and the American war machine kept murdering people abroad. And Hayes is making a common liberal mistake, namely seeing Trump as the cause of daily misery in America, whereas the left sees Trump more as a symptom of the daily misery in America. Misery that the Democrats did almost nothing to ameliorate when they were in power under Obama. But Chris continued, now look where we are. There are 205,000 dead Americans and 1,000 more every day. 7 million have been sickened, tens of millions out of work. His own task force staffer has come forward to say he does not care about those deaths and thinks his own supporters are disgusting. Yes, all of those things are very bad. But under the liberal status quo with Obamacare, 30,000 people died unnecessarily every year because they lacked health insurance. And yes, those numbers have increased unacceptably under the pandemic, but the pandemic today is worse than it could have been had liberals passed, say, Medicare for all. But Chris reminds us, Trump has done many, many bad things, like separating children from their parents at the border. Now, of course, this is an absolutely horrifying thing, but it is also true that under Obama, more people were deported than in any other administration in history. And to the left, like people like me, the destruction of millions of lives by physically removing them from their homes was and is unacceptable. But to liberals, it was cool when their guy did it. Extend this logic to anything else you like, say the drone war or climate policy. I always remind people that the Standing Rock protests were under Obama. And the reason why the left is averse to the hashtag resistance liberals is because their reaction to Trump goes one of two ways. The first is to hysterically scream over some superficial norm that Trump broke, while then voting to give him more power. This became crystal clear when the Democrats were voting to impeach Trump, a totally empty gesture that they knew would do literally nothing given that the Senate is controlled by the Republicans and they would never get rid of their own guy, while at the same time, the same exact time, voting to increase Trump's military budget by $738 billion. Now, of course, you don't hear much about this on MSNBC. MSNBC will have an absolute meltdown and give round-the-clock coverage when some random Russian guy emails Don Jr. to say something like, hey, wouldn't it be cool if Hillary Clinton were in jail? But when a dangerous madman like Trump gets more power, not a peep. The second tack that resistance liberals do to oppose Trump that drives the left crazy is that they oppose Trump from the right. Just 2 days ago, Joe Biden tweeted this: En el Día de la Virgen de las Mercedes, acompaño en solidaridad a todos los defensores de derechos humanos de Cuba, Nicaragua y Venezuela, y rezo por la liberación de todos los presos políticos. Wow, I almost wept. And back in May, Joe Biden tweeted this: Trump's international failures have cleared a path for Cuba to join the UN Human Rights Council. The horror, the horror. This would betray Cuba's political prisoners and further undermine U.S. diplomacy. As president, I will lead by empowering the Cuban people and defending human rights. So apparently, to the liberals, Trump, whose administration likely participated in the hilarious Bay of Piglets coup attempt in Venezuela, which was this year, by the way, whose administration rolled back the Obama-era détente with Cuba, including a fresh round of sanctions just this week, is actually not hawkish enough on Cuba and Venezuela. But of course, the most glaring example of this is with the liberal obsession on fighting a new Cold War with Russia. And for that, Chris Hayes and his network MSNBC deserve a whole lot of blame. Of course, Obama famously and rightly advocated for an easing of tensions with Russia.
Governor Romney, I'm glad that you recognize that al-Qaeda is a threat, because a few months ago, when you were asked what's the biggest geopolitical threat facing America, you said Russia. Not al-Qaeda, you said Russia. In the 1980s are now calling to ask for their foreign policy back.
But all of that has gone out the window in the last 4 years under Trump. And again, liberals do this thing where they only see above the surface. They go apoplectic when Trump says something nice about Putin, but then ignore the fact that, for example, in June of this year, Trump sent 1,000 more American troops to Poland to, quote, bolster NATO's eastern flank against Russian aggression. I mean, that's just an incredibly aggressive move. Imagine what U.S. policymakers would do if Russia sent 1,000 troops to Mexico. But of course, none of that is discussed. Instead, Chris Hayes, who back in 2008, when he was at The Nation, praised something called the Pundit Accountability Project as something that was, quote, long overdue, gave favorable airtime on his own show to the absolutely bonkers, insane, 1,000% fake news Jonathan Chait assertion that Trump has been a Russian intelligence asset since 1987.
Did the Trump campaign, did the candidate at the heart of it conspire with Russia to subvert American democracy? And does Russia have some kind of leverage over Donald Trump? In a new cover story from New York Magazine, writer Jonathan Chait argues we have not allowed ourselves to consider the full range of possibilities. Chait lays out what could be considered the worst case scenario for Trump-Russia collusion, that Donald Trump has been a Russian intelligence asset since 1987.
Yeah, I just want to take a pause here and really underscore what is seriously being discussed in this cable news segment, which is based on a cover story in New York Mag, one of the 3 or 4 most prominent liberal magazines, that Donald Trump has been essentially a Russian spy since 1987. I mean, 1987, not to mention the fact that the Soviet Union was still around back then, but Trump himself was a real estate goon trying to get with Heather Locklear at the Vanity Fair Christmas party, only to turn her down because she was very nasty to him or whatever. But let's continue with the segment.
Everyone always says, well, this has been Trump's view forever. All this stuff he's saying about the Western allies splitting us apart from the West and how he's sort of pissing on them all the time and saying, we should let them go their own way. That's just what he's always thought. It's not really what he's always thought. It's what he's thought since 1987. He never thought that before then, or at least he never said it before then. And in 1987 is when he went to Moscow and he's feted by the Russians and tours Moscow. And then he comes back. Then he starts talking about running for president for the first time. And then he starts talking for the first time about how our allies are a bunch of freeloaders and we should kick them to the curb.
Yeah, and we should say that he is, I just want to be clear here, he is really consistent on that point, right? The idea that this sort of zero-sum view that our allies are free riding and we're paying for it. He takes out full-page ads at $100,000. He sounds identical to how he does now, right? The idea that, like, we're getting abused, we're getting taken for granted, and we're paying for other people's defense.
We're paying for other people's defense who were defending against the Russians.
Right, at that point particularly, yes.
So it really dovetails with Russian foreign policy interests then and now.
I can't stress just how irresponsible this kind of thing is. I mean, who watches cable news, right? Boomers. And think about your own boomer mother and father. They came up in an age where if the TV man said it, it must be true. Certainly, both of my parents are like that. If the man on the TV says something, it's because it's probably true. But of course, this is not true. The central claims of Russiagate that MSNBC and Chris Hayes have been pushing for years have all fallen apart. The P-tape is not real. The compromat does not exist. Trump has not been a Russian spy since 1987. Robert Mueller exited our lives as quickly as he entered them, having done literally nothing. But Russiagate was the central plank of the liberal opposition to Trump, not the horrifying policies that harmed actual people, not the gutting of what little was left of the environmental protections, not the anti-labor fanatics he's appointed to the National Labor Relations Board, as Paul Prescott outlined this week in Jacobin. Everyone go ahead and read that. But most of all, the liberals don't understand that Trump can only exist because of decades of the failure of liberal governance. This was something that Chris Hayes himself once wrote about quite eloquently in his 2012 book, Twilight of the Elites, where he described the sequences of bipartisan failures from the late 90s through the aughts with things like Enron, the Catholic Church abuse, the Iraq War, and the financial crisis, and how those failures corroded our society and our democracy. But here's Chris in 2020, concluding his viral thread with this stirring call to arms. And yet, you still see the savvy arms-length mode of analysis across the spectrum. Oh, calm down, libs. Is it really so bad? More Americans have died in the last 6 months than during any 6-month period in 100 years. Yes, it's that bad. Wake the hell up. Yes, it is that bad, but this is not new. It's been bad. And yes, the Republicans and Trump are evil and have always been evil and will always be evil. But liberals and the Democratic Party have been complicit in that as well. Wake the hell up.
Yeah, you know, you raised a lot of really great points. You raised a lot of good points, and I loved how comprehensive you were. There is one area where I think I agree a little bit with Chris Hayes and disagree with some of the narrative coming from the left, right? I agree. Liberals have paved the way for Trump, and you gave perfect examples of that. And I do think that what we see from mainstream media is this, like, you know, this need to make Trump out to be like incredibly unique in his awfulness, while completely ignoring some of the similar actions that took place prior to Trump, getting elected into office. The one thing that I think the left can do a little better on is I think they like kind of stop at, well, things were bad before, right? And they don't really give any credibility to some of the very specific ways in which Trump is worse, right? So Trump really does rely on dividing the country in like the worst possible way. And I'm sure other presidents have done that, but not to the same extent. Like Trump wittingly, intentionally wants Americans to hate each other, to fight each other. We have paramilitary groups in the country now going around murdering people, and you have the right wing justifying those murders. You also have the expiration of the consent decree that would prevent Republicans from sending armed law enforcement to in-person polling locations, with the effort to intimidate voters. Well, that consent decree has expired, and what did Republicans do? What did the Trump campaign do? They immediately hired 50,000 armed people to show up to in-person voting locations throughout the country. So, like, I think that the left makes so many great points, but in order to really make those points in a credible way, they also need to acknowledge some of the very specific ways in which Trump is particularly awful. You get what I'm saying? No, totally. I mean, and I think that what Trump in that kind of cuts both ways with Trump, in that it's very clarifying, in that he it's like a mask off situation. It's like we're not even pretending anymore. We're not doing the kabuki theater anymore. We're just kind of saying the thing that we really mean. Like George W. Bush was very skilled at the sort of rhetorical kind of outreaches to people, even like in the wake of 9/11, to like people like Muslims and stuff like that. Like he didn't do, like, imagine if Trump was like after 9/11, he would be like, all the Muslims, we just kill them all, whereas George Bush like understood that rhetorically he had to kind of make that
that claimed to be the president of the whole country. George Bush was also famously very kind of rhetorically positive towards Hispanics. He did not seek to divide the country, especially along racial lines, the way Trump explicitly does time and time again. And of course, that's very, very, very bad. But I think that in general, the reason why I feel like I need to push back on the sort of liberal critiques of Trump that are almost purely superficial. Like, rarely do they have to do with like concrete policies, which is, and the proof of that is the liberal nostalgia for George Bush.
I know.
Because he knew how to play the game, a little bit better.
Yep.
I mean, at the time they thought he was ridiculous, but now there's like this kind of nostalgia, even though George Bush, like from a concrete policy standpoint, like if we're like counting bodies, like this is he started the Iraq War, like the greatest crime probably in 30, 40 years in world history.
And every president, has further expanded upon that type of foreign policy. Like Obama did that. He expanded upon, drone strikes and things like that. And then, it paves the way for someone like Trump to come into office. And Trump has already surpassed drone strikes compared to the Obama administration.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's the thing. Like, I think that is a completely accurate description of how this all went down. I think part of my issue, and I think where I agree with Chris Hayes a little bit, is the left will criticize Obama for his drone policy, but then they just kind of stop there and kind of refuse to acknowledge that Trump has taken that policy and put it on steroids. Like the criticism does also need to extend to Trump. And I think sometimes the way that the left comes off, and I don't think they intentionally do this, I think it's a problem with messaging. Sometimes because the left wants to contextualize things and explain things in a much more robust, detailed way, sometimes they forget to finish the explanation by, ending with what Trump is able to do and how he's able to take these awful policies and go even further because liberals have paved the way. You get what I'm saying?
No, totally. And, I think that the sort of tactical debate that can be had for that is that, I think many people on the left kind of instinctively feel that their immediate political goal needs to be some sort of takeover of the Democratic Party, that without that, we're just going to see, further and further devolvement of the country into this kind of like right-wing hell state, that without sort of being able to take over the only opposition party, that they're hopeless to stop that. So, I mean, what are we going to do if we have to like kind of get between, they're standing in between us and fighting the right,
Yeah, you're right.
And until we can do that, we can't be in the position to really like fight the right. Like if we're ceding that fight to liberals right now because they're the ones in the positions of power in the sort of opposition, they're never going to be able to do it. They're just not going to be able to do it. So kind of the immediate goal of the left should be in some way, a defeat of the current iteration of the Democratic Party, if that makes sense. And there's all kinds of tactical issues that come up with that, like, I mean, namely whether like it's better for Biden or Trump to win on that narrow tactical ground, right? Like I happen to believe we're probably better off with Biden in there than with Trump, but there is tactical questions, right? But I think that rhetorical, that the right's going to think we're like they look to the left and see this like undifferentiated mass of like Maoists or something. It doesn't matter like to them what like it doesn't make a huge difference to them like if the criticisms are from libs or from leftists. Like it's the real kind of goal is liberals. I mean, I at least that's how I can understand it.
Yeah, I say this often, especially after what we've experienced with these resistance members of Congress. We need to know our enemies, and you're absolutely right. Our biggest enemies right now are these neoliberal lawmakers and people like Nancy Pelosi. I wrote a piece for The Hill that listed all the different ways in which Nancy Pelosi has actually aided and abetted Donald Trump. And of course, heads exploded. People came after me on Twitter. I don't care because I show my work and the evidence is there. literally on the same day that Congress, the House, is listing the impeachment charges against Donald Trump, Nancy Pelosi does a press conference where she's like, would you look at that? We worked with Donald Trump to pass his rebranded version of NAFTA. Isn't he so great? Like, what are you doing? What are you doing? So anyway, I think, I love the way you tackled that. I think your response to Chris Hayes is on the mark. And I saw a lot of outrage toward what he had to tweet in that thread. And I was really hoping that someone would address it in a comprehensive way like you did. So thank you.
Glad I could help.